But just wanted to say welcome back. This is the second of our 6-part series on organic vegetable production for small scale growers. Today we have Alex Hessler from Virginia Tech. I'll let him introduce himself just a little bit when he gets started, but we're excited about that. And I'll let him decide if he wants to do questions throughout or save them for the end. But the chat box, it should be live so that you can type in your questions, and we'll just make sure that we take time to revisit that at the end of the presentation. So I will turn it over to Alex now, and I'll be looking after the chat and participant list.
Great, thank you. Let me go ahead and share my screen here, give a little more visual context to the words coming out of my mouth. Slideshow. All right, can everybody see my screen that says intensive vegetable production? Thumbs up. Hello.
Yeah, it's working.
Oh, okay, great. All right, well, thanks for inviting me to this really interesting and important workshop series. I am an instructor in the School of Plant and Environmental Sciences, and I, in addition to teaching courses related to organic vegetable production for undergraduate students, I manage Home Field Farm, which is Virginia Tech's student organic farm. And we have about 6 acres in production, and a course that I teach takes place at that farm in the spring and fall semester, and students learn about all aspects of running the operation. We also have 2 high tunnels, and all of the produce that we grow is given to the dining halls on campus. So we've got a really neat relationship and collaboration with the chefs and dining administrators on campus. Also, 2 years ago, my wife and I began operating Riverstone Organic Farm, which is a certified organic vegetable farm in Floyd, Virginia. It's actually been established since about 2011, and in 2019, spring 2019, my wife and I took over the operation. We're leasing the business. We're operating it as Riverstone Organic Farm under our own LLC. We have about 15 acres in production, and we sell to farmers markets, local grocery stores, restaurants, and we have a CSA and an on-farm store as well. And we're strictly vegetables, and we have about 5 high tunnels as well. And as I mentioned earlier, when we were just chatting before the presentation started, I have made the brash and crazy and impulsive decision to quit my job at Virginia Tech and join my wife working full-time on our farm starting January 1 of 2021. So I'm really, really excited about that new step in my farming career and obsession, which it certainly is. So I am actually going to be showing you all a PowerPoint presentation that I gave at the Virginia Cooperative Extension Winter Conference last year that was specifically about intensive vegetable production. And I presented with several other faculty members at Virginia Tech and Virginia State who brought other areas of expertise like insect pest management and soil fertility to our presentation. And we chose to really hone in on the concept of intensive for our discussion. And some of y'all, I'm sure, have heard that word before, perhaps in the context of farming as well. And it has a similar connotation as small scale, which of course is the title of this workshop series. But I think it actually defines even more clearly the nature of the farming practices used in small scale vegetable production. And the best way to define it is to contrast it to the opposite end of the spectrum in farming practices, which would be extensive. So intensive refers to the amount of and the degree of time, energy, resources, inputs, labor, and yields that go into a piece of ground producing vegetables on a kind of per square foot, or you could say per acre basis. Intensive farming focuses on maximizing all of those inputs of materials and management to maximize output, yield. Whereas extensive refers to taking advantage of an opportunity where you have a lot of space. Perhaps you're not as land limited, and this would be the best way to describe, large scale vegetable production, 15, 20 acres and up. And of course, 15 and 20 acres is still really small on the in the grand scheme of things, but it shares characteristics with larger scale farms, which is that because you are growing on more land than you can possibly manage with hand tools, you have to use equipment. And because you are using equipment, you have to space things out so that tractors can drive through, tractors for spreading fertilizer and for cultivating weeds and for pulling mechanical harvesting devices. And you're capturing the efficiencies of using machines and tractors because you can kind of spread out and get the same yield on a larger area. So in that system, you are more extensive, your land versus intensive with your resources and time and energy and inputs. So typically, small scale farms are more intensive in nature. Large scale farms are more extensive in nature. Does anybody have any questions about that, or does that kind of ring true to you, or am I kind of creating a clear picture for you with how we're talking about these two different approaches? All right, I'll take the silence as everything's crystal clear. Now, when you talk about small scale farming, especially in the South, which is just has so much history and culture that's even around today, still surrounding small scale farming, because we have so much rural land and people who value good food and getting outside and gardening. A concept in small scale farming often comes up, and that's the truck farm. And truck farming is often thought of as defined as a truck farm because you can put all your veggies on the back of a pickup truck and take it to market. The word truck is actually synonymous with haul, and it just refers to an era when all vegetables were grown locally and hauled to market in whatever vehicle, whether it was a truck or a wagon, and sold directly off of that vehicle at a local farmer's market. And around the 40s and 50s, small scale tractors that were suited to that type of farming were invented. Things like the Farmall 140 and the Farmall Cub, and the Alice G. There's I guess that's a Farmall Cub pictured on the bottom left. These things were invented, and these were the tractors that were suited to farming vegetables on a small scale in that day and age. And they were actually used to cultivate corn and soybeans too. And with the resurgence in interest in small scale farming, a lot of small farmers are picking up these old tractors and mimicking these old truck farming practices, whereby everything is grown on a single row that can be straddled by these very narrow little tractors so that they can be cultivated mechanically, as in, i.e. weeded mechanically with the sweeps and shovels and cultivators that are mounted underneath this. And it certainly is nice to not have to control your weeds with hoeing or hand weeding, but this is a tricky situation because it still requires spacing things out to allow for the use of these tractors. And if you are on a small scale farm where you have 3 or less acres of land, you typically cannot afford to waste the amount of space that is required to use these small scale tractors. Because you are land limited on a small scale farm, you must be more intensive with your use of space. And you can see in this right-hand picture, this farmer has just slammed vegetables into the area. There's hardly enough room to walk. And the per square foot or per acre output is just so much higher. And this is how small scale farmers are being successful today. In an era when everything costs more, labor costs more, we have more expenses that we're trying to cover in our lives, our smartphones, our insurance, our healthcare, our heating bill, our cars. We cannot afford on a small scale piece of land, 3 or 4 acres or less, to grow extensively using these old tractors. So I just want to kind of caution you all who may be interested in this type of farming that you might be drawn to this approach, but on a really small scale of using these old tractors, but on a really small scale, there are other techniques that you need to employ to grow more intensively. So why intensive? And we could also, we could say why small scale. First of all, there's a low barrier to entry. I'm trying to get rid of this. There's a little window that I want to, there we go. If you're starting a farm or you already have a small piece of land, you don't have to throw down the capital to purchase a large piece. It's a lot easier to start. If you don't own lots of equipment or don't have a lot of money to buy equipment or adverse to taking out loans, or just aren't familiar with or comfortable with operating and maintaining equipment, which is a huge learning curve, then farming on a smaller scale with less equipment might be more appropriate. Because we're using much more intensive approaches where we're maximizing yield per square foot, the returns can be much, much higher. And they can be very, very high. And a family or an individual can perhaps make a living on an acre or two, which is just not feasible with an extensive approach transplanted onto a small piece of land, which is what you are doing when you try to use tractors on 2 or 3 acres or less for cultivation and planting. The other benefit is that this is a type of approach that's well suited to natural farming techniques, and whether that your farm is certified organic or not doesn't really matter. If you are interested in using techniques that focus on building soil quality and health, managing pests with minimal use of pesticides, promoting biodiversity on your farm, this is a technique to farming that's well suited to that. And the marketing outlets like farmers markets and CSAs often target consumers who are interested in purchasing naturally grown or organically grown vegetables. There is, and maybe we could say this every year for the last 5 years and hopefully for the next 5 years, an amazing opportunity to start in small scale intensive vegetable production right now. There's a huge demand for fresh, local, healthy, naturally grown produce, especially in the off season, using high tunnels when it's too cold to grow things outside. The demand is really high. Something interesting is that, and maybe others on this talk could speak to this, but the demand for local food, vegetables and animal products has skyrocketed during the COVID pandemic. We could talk all day about, and theorize why that might be. In my own experience, talking with our own customers, people want to know where their food's coming from. They want the sense of security that they're getting it from somebody down the road or in their community. And maybe they want to be able to get their food without having to go into a grocery store. We've seen it at our farm store and our CSA and at farmers markets. Demand for local food has exploded, and I hope it continues that way. If you grow without the use of pesticides, and if you choose to be certified organic or certified naturally grown, which is an alternative certification scheme, people are often willing to pay more money for the products that you sell. And because this is a technique that's well suited for small pieces of land, it opens up an opportunity to produce your crops very close to your markets in an urban or suburban area where large parcels of land aren't available. Also, at least where I'm at in Southwest Virginia, there's not a lot of big pieces of flat ground that are well suited for tractor-based farming. So we're kind of restricted to small parcels of land on river bottoms or hilltops. And we can often find those close to urban markets, which means not only are our transportation costs less, but we have an opportunity to bring people to the farm, to an on-farm stand, and create that consumer-farmer relationship that can help bring back repeat customers and promote customer loyalty. So something to ask yourself if you're thinking about this is, do you have the right markets and the right consumers in your area to support this type of farming? Because in order to make good money on a small piece of land, you have to grow crops that have a high return per unit area. Those are things like salad greens, heirloom tomatoes, cherry tomatoes, sweet specialty peppers, baby bunched roots like carrots, beets, turnips, radishes, unusual things like kohlrabi and bok choy, and greens, kale, lettuce, Swiss chard. There simply isn't enough room to grow potatoes and sweet potatoes and sweet corn and pumpkins on a 3 or 4 acre farm to make good money. So this is a system that's suited for a market and a customer base that is motivated to buy these types of products because they are interested in cooking. They have a wide palette for lots of different types of vegetables. They're willing to pay a little extra money because it's organic and it's local and it's fresh. And there are plenty of places, even in Southwest Virginia and Western Virginia, that are well to this: Blacksburg, Floyd, Roanoke, Charlottesville, Lynchburg, Lexington. And maybe those are even an hour and a half away, but that's still close enough. But if you are expecting to market to very small towns or rural areas, there may not be the customer base that could support these types of crops. So that's just something to ask yourself and to look into. Any questions so far? Somebody's just say something, so the connection hasn't fallen off and I'm talking to an empty screen.
Linda's still here.
Okay, good. Linda's here. All right. One thing I want to do as we kind of walk through this type of farming system is to highlight several farmers that have really risen to the top as farmers that exemplify intensive farming and have had great success with it and have become what me and a lot of people refer to as rock star farmers. They are prolific on social media. They speak at conferences. Many of them have their own online courses that are, video and worksheet based. And then part of for the course includes getting access to them for texting and consultation and emailing for questions. And there's information out there about small scale intensive farming that just simply isn't available at universities, because most vegetable production on a per land basis and per gross income basis in Virginia and in our country is large scale vegetable production. So that is generally the demographic that our research and extension efforts served over the last 40 years. That's certainly changing, this workshop being an example of that. But there's so much valuable information out there that wasn't there 5 years ago, coming from the farmers who are doing this successfully, that you can access for free on social media and for a fee through their own courses. So, and I just want to emphasize, I learned so much about farming from Instagram. And if you are, whether you are a beginning farmer or a seasoned farmer, and maybe there's another social media platform that suits you best, but Instagram has really risen to the top as a medium where farmers across the country and across the world post pictures without all the BS and ads, so much kind of personal information, just raw images of their farms on a weekly or even daily basis. And it's as if you are getting a personal tour of their entire operation, from their production practices to their field, their fields to their packing sheds. They show their mistakes, their successes, their equipment, their techniques, and you can scroll back for years and see how they've developed. And over time, you will accumulate a group of farmers that you admire and are learning from, and their pictures are always there for you to reference when you're wondering, how far apart do they plant their lettuce? How did they set up this piece of equipment that I just bought? Is everybody struggling with this rain we're having now, and how are they dealing with it? How are people attaching fans on their high tunnels? You can find these images. So I just want to beat that into you, that you can learn a heck of a lot on social media right now by honing in on the farms that are really doing a good job. So Jean-Martin Fortier and his wife operate a farm in Quebec, and he wrote this book, The Market Gardener, where he explained his techniques, and he uses some really interesting techniques that are kind of new as of about 3 or 4 years ago that I'll explain here in a minute. He also offers a online for fee market gardening class. So if you're interested in this, him and his farm and his resources are definitely something to look into. Another one is Neversink Farm, operated by Connor Crickmore. Just an amazing farmer. A lot of the beautiful images that I'll show in this PowerPoint are credited to him. He's really setting the bar for not only maximizing yield per square foot, but using tools and techniques to make it easy to manage. So I suggest you look at him on social media, and he also offers a very extensive online course and has designed a series of his own hand tools that work really well for intensive vegetable production. Let me see. Okay, another one is Rose Creek Farm, and this guy's down in the south, so a lot of the challenges that he faces in terms of heat and humidity and bugs and diseases might be a little more relevant for us relative to these folks up north. One of the things that Rose Creek Farm has really mastered is year-round lettuce production. Lettuce is a very profitable crop. There's a high demand for it all year long, but it can be difficult to grow, not only during the winter, but during the summer when it tends to bolt with heat. And he's developed a lot of techniques to deal with that. So he's got some free and some paid resources about the techniques he uses. And then the last one that I have to mention, because this guy really pioneered and mainstreamed intensive vegetable production techniques in the United States about 30 years ago, is a fellow named Elliot Coleman from Maine. He is obviously operating in a very cold climate, but with the use of row covers and high tunnels is able to grow many cool season crops all year long. And that means that there's no competition. The demand is still high, the price high, and the quality is great because there's just no diseases and insects during that time of year. So if you're interested in learning about season extension and growing during all through the winter, this is definitely somebody that you want to look into. And he's got other books that focus specifically on growing during the winter. All right. So the rockstar farmers, some of the rockstar farmers to know and to follow and to learn from, and a lot of the images that I'll use come from their farms. And now we're going to talk about the specifics to the tools and techniques that make intensive vegetable production productive and successful. And I just want to highlight that all elements of this farming system are unique from large-scale extensive production, from the varieties to the tools to the spacing to the soil management techniques to the pest management techniques. So there's a lot of really neat tools and techniques that we'll highlight, and all of these tools and techniques work together. It's important to understand that this is a system, and that each of these different tools and techniques kind of build on each other, and oftentimes don't work if they don't exist in harmony with the other techniques that are a part of this system. So first and foremost, soil in all types of farming is fundamental to growing healthy crops. And that is especially true with intensive production, because your utmost objective is to maximize output per unit area. You're going to be putting a lot of management, time, input into the ground to grow these crops, and the profit potential is high because you're growing things like bunched greens and baby roots and salad mix. So investing in soil is extremely important, and it pays dividends for yields. Good quality soil obviously starts with selecting an appropriate site that's got plenty of sun, that's well drained, but it doesn't have to have inherently good soil to begin with. One of the beauties of small scale intensive production is, because of the profit potential, it really pays to invest in building soil quality. So even if you're starting with hard, chunky, yellow, orange clay, you can turn that into this beautiful brown, rich organic matter soil relatively quickly. One way that intensive farmers use to establish a new garden site without investing in a tractor, or beating themselves up trying to till up sod with a rototiller, is with the use of these black tarps. This is a silage tarp. It's used to cover and seal silage in a silage bunk so that it ferments anaerobically. But when it's laid over the ground, especially when it's warm, it suffocates the plants growing underneath it. It deprives them of light, and it creates a warm, moist environment for microbes and earthworms to start breaking down that organic material, so that when you peel it back after a couple months, you've killed the existing vegetation and caused the clumps of roots break down and decompose. So this is a very easy, kind of hands-off way to establish a new vegetable site. I'm sure most of the folks on this webinar are gardeners to some extent, so what compost is and how valuable of a resource it is. On large-scale farms, farmers often do use compost. Maybe they make it or buy it, or manure as an amendment to their soil to add organic matter and nutrients, typically to the tune of maybe 10,000 to 20,000 pounds per acre. But if you've ever spread manure with the manure spreader, 10 to 20,000 pounds an acre is a fairy dusting. If you stand back from the field, you can hardly see it. And if you look closely, there's just little clumps here and there. And it just isn't economically feasible to spread much more than that. On a small scale farm, or even in your home garden, you have the opportunity, because you're only dealing with an acre or fractions of an acre, to load the soil up with compost. And many small scale farms accelerate their soil from crappy, weathered, degraded clay to this gorgeous black, Iowa topsoil in a matter of 1 or 2 years by spreading prodigious amounts of compost, 4 to 6 acres. In areas with a lot of rainfall, it's probably a good idea to till that in, because especially if you're on a slope, because it can wash off. Some farmers actually choose to just lay it on top and plant right into it. And the beauty of that technique is that you smother the weeds. You're planting in the compost, which hopefully, if it's made well, is weed free, and the weeds that are smothered beneath it aren't close enough to the surface to germinate. So I think that if you take away anything from this presentation, remember that you can turn your soil into black gold in a day by paying for 1 or 10 dump trucks of compost and spreading it around and mixing it in, and voila, you can have this. Now, there are some concerns with excessive phosphorus and potassium buildup if you use compost made from animal manure. So it's best to use that sparingly if you are using compost to build soil quality in this manner. It's certainly great to use animal manure or animal manure-based composts appropriately every year to add nutrients. If you use it to just turn your soil into this, it's best to use more vegetable matter, I should say vegetative matter based compost, like municipal yard scraps or hay or stuff like that. In vegetable farming, we are often planting small seeds or transplants that require loose, clean, level soil conditions in order to be planted at the appropriate depth and to germinate successfully. So tillage is a necessary element of creating those conditions. Now, many of you may know that excessive tillage over time can degrade soil quality by opening it up and incorporating so much oxygen that microbes eat organic matter and ultimately cause the organic matter content to decline over time. That is certainly true, but as managers of soil, it is our duty to make sure that we compensate for the withdrawals from soil quality caused by tillage with inputs or investments into soil quality with additions of organic matter or compost. So just keep that in mind, that tillage does have its consequences, but it is usually a necessary element to create the conditions for planting vegetables. The seed bed is the top 1 or 2 inches on top of the soil or the raised bed, if you choose to make raised beds, where the seed or the transplant is actually going to go. And that layer of the soil is the most important part of your soil preparation techniques. If it isn't level, or if it's chunky, or it's got lots of old dead material and roots and stalks from the previous crop, or chunks of undecomposed leaves that you added on, and didn't give them enough time to break down, that is going to cause challenges, a cascading series of challenges throughout the rest of the season, from causing poor germination to interfering with the operation of your push seeder, to interfering with cultivation, causing weeds to grow, making it more difficult to harvest. So creating a flat, even, fine, and somewhat firm, not compacted, but somewhat firm seed bed is critical. Everything hinges on creating a good seed bed. In Southwest Virginia, and actually, and especially in Carroll County, we have large-scale vegetable growers who have pioneered no-till vegetable production techniques for crops like cabbage and broccoli and pumpkins and winter squash. And no-till is accomplished by using herbicides to kill a cover crop or whatever weeds might be growing, and then using equipment that's designed to cut through that residue and plant the seeds or transplant without having to till the soil. And that's fantastic, especially for our region where it's so hilly that the potential for erosion is very high. Hopefully, if you're practicing intensive vegetable production, you have a fairly flat piece of ground, so the erosion potential isn't as much of a concern. But you still may be interested in minimizing tillage on a yearly basis, partly because it does have soil quality benefits, but also you may not have access to the tractors to accomplish the tillage that you need. The other benefit is that by not inverting the soil, you don't bring new seeds to the soil surface. The weeds that germinate in a given year are only the weed seeds that are in the top 2 inches. So if you don't invert the soil, you can kind of eliminate the weeds in the top 2 inches and leave the weed seeds that are deep down, for them to just slowly die and deteriorate over time. So there's some weed management benefits to minimizing tillage as well. On a small scale farm, a lot of these rockstar growers are using modified no-till techniques, and I would say they're kind of stretching the interpretation of the word no-till. I think they're very proud of that concept. But I think a better word to describe what they're doing is minimum tillage. And the way they accomplish that is performing the deep soil loosening with something like this broad fork, which is just a super beefy, garden fork. And when they jab that into the ground and work it back, it can loosen up compacted layers without inverting the soil. And then they use a rototiller, or in this picture on the right, a tool that's sold by Johnny's Seeds called a tilther, which is basically a drill-powered rototiller to just barely till the top cups of the soil. That's usually necessary to incorporate any fertilizer that you may have spread, and to create that level, fine seed bed that you need to plant your seeds and transplants. So this is a really neat kind of low tech, somewhat manual intensive, but very simple approach to preparing your seed without bringing out the rototiller and really churning the soil up. I am a huge fan of using cover crops to rebuild soil quality when I'm not growing vegetables. We're fortunate enough at the student farm at Virginia Tech to have enough land that we don't have to grow on every acre that we have every year, so we can actually grow cover crops for an entire year. And with every field, when we finish harvesting a crop, we usually plant an overwintering cover crop like rye or wheat or vetch or clover, to rebuild the soil and protect it over the winter. However, on a small scale intensive farming, cover crops might not be appropriate in every situation. First of all, and this is particularly true with summer cover crops, they occupy valuable real estate that you need to be using to grow crops. Your goal on a small scale farm is to maximize the output of every square foot, and cover crops just, they're not a harvestable crop, so they don't do that for you. With small scale tools like garden rototillers or weed eaters or push lawnmowers, it may be difficult to kill and incorporate all this residue, and you might find that you're fighting this residue that's resisting decomposing, and you're not getting a good seed bed to plant your crops. One approach that may work and does have a role is an overwintering cover crop when you're just totally done for the season, that is very tender and easy to kill and incorporate in the spring. So something like something like rye or wheat might not be a good option because it produces a ton of biomass and it can be difficult to kill and incorporate in the spring. But clover or peas or oats, which actually winter kill, so by the time spring comes around, they're already dead, can be a good way to cover and protect fields or beds that you're not using. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, don't we need to grow cover crops to rebuild soil quality? We do need to rebuild soil quality. Cover crops may not be the right tool to do that on a small scale intensive farm. Compost is probably the best way to do that, because you can apply compost and in one fell swoop apply many, many times more organic matter than that cover crop would have sequestered and added to the soil. And it happens in an instant, and there's no residue to decompose. On a large scale farm, it's not feasible to add that much compost or manure, and we've got this extra space, so cover crops fit that role better. When you are using compost as intensively as I would suggest, if you're growing on a small scale piece of land and want to maximize your output, you may be able to provide all of the N, P, and K, nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium that your crops need, in addition to the micronutrients, with the compost alone. But the only way to know that for sure is to get a soil test. The soil test will tell you if you need to add any additional phosphorus or potassium or micronutrients, or adjust the pH beyond what the compost provided. Now, if y'all have ever submitted a soil test, you know that they don't tell you the nitrogen content of your soil. And that is because nitrogen in the form that it exists in soil is readily leached by water, and it's constantly being used and transformed by microbes. So the snapshot that a soil test provides isn't going to be relevant months later when you are, or even potentially weeks later, when you are actually ready to plant your crop and are thinking about fertilizer. So the nitrogen recommendation of the soil test is just based on what the crop needs. But you can account for what the compost provides if you can get a compost analysis from the compost company that you bought it from, or just assume that it's probably about 1% nitrogen. That's a pretty safe bet. And if you add 1,000 pounds of compost, 1% of 1,000 is 10, right? Yeah. But keep in mind that compost is very stable, and the nitrogen in it is bound up and integrated into very stable humus compounds that don't degrade readily. So only about 15% of the nitrogen in the compost is going to be released for your plants in that given year. So only 15% of 10 pounds or 1.5 pounds out of 1,000 pounds of compost is going to be available. Now, if you apply 100,000 pounds per acre, that's a different story. And you might ask yourself, well, what about the other 85%? Where is that nitrogen? Well, it's bound up in humus compounds that are very stable and resistant to decay, but they do break down slowly over the course of years and decades. So the way to understand how much nitrogen you're getting from that bank of compost that is slowly decaying over time is based off of the rule of thumb. And this, you can find this in extension publications from many universities, that for every 1% soil organic matter you have, you can expect about 10 pounds of nitrogen per acre to be released that year. So Home Field Farm at Virginia Tech has about 2% organic matter. So I credit about 20 pounds of nitrogen per year available from my compost. Now, if we were in Eastern Virginia where it was super sandy and our organic matter content was very low, well, then we're not going to get as much nitrogen from the organic matter that's there. So we're going to go on to planting and establishing our crops. Many crops are transplanted by starting seeds in a greenhouse in trays and then planted outside when they are 5 or 7 weeks old. And some crops are direct seeded, where the seeds are just planted directly in the soil. Typically, the plants that are transplanted are plants that get very big. And because they get very big, they're spaced far apart, like several, 1 or 2 or even 3 feet apart. So it pays to plant a plant because growing it's alive, rather than put a seed and hope that it germinates and doesn't get killed by a mouse or decayed by some fungus, because then you've got a 3-foot gap where there's nothing. And you should always grow at least 20% more plants than you think you'll need, so that if it does die, you can put it in the ground. There's some other benefits to to transplanting that I'll discuss in a minute, but crops that are very small and that are planted very close together, like carrots, beets, baby greens, like baby lettuce and spinach, radishes, turnips, and green beans and sugar snap peas are typically direct seeded. And there are a lot of different direct seeding tools on the market. Some of them you can pick up at a local hardware store. A really common one is called the Earthway seeder. It's about $150, and it's got different plates for different size seeds. But if you are serious about doing this, to make an income, I would suggest purchasing something a little more sophisticated. And the most commonly used push seeder among intensive vegetable farmers in this country is something called a Jang seeder. It costs, I haven't looked at it recently, but I think it costs at least $300 or $400 for this 1-row model. And this 5-row model in the center costs about $1,000, but it has plastic rollers with different size holes for different size seeds, and it has different sprockets that can allow you to seed with much more precision than the other tools that are available. And that's really, really important because you want to make sure you have a full stand of crops. You don't want gaps because that's wasted real estate. And you really don't want to have to be spending time out there bent over thinning carrots and beets and turnips down the appropriate density in order to get, full-sized crops. Now, again, the advantages of transplants are many. And farmers almost always transplant crops that get big and are spaced far apart and are very valuable. Like each individual plant is very valuable. An individual carrot is much less valuable than an individual broccoli plant or an individual tomato plant. So those things are typically transplanted. The other benefits are that you have an end of weeds because the plant is already 7 weeks old. You have certainty in the plant population because you're planted an existing plant, and if it dies, you can throw in another one. You can get an earlier yield because you've started it in a nice cozy greenhouse or in your windowsill, and when you plant it, it's already established and growing. And if you can shave 3 or 4 weeks off of the amount of time it takes from when you put the plant in the ground to when you harvest it from a seed versus a transplant, that's could potentially allow you to double or even triple or quadruple crop a bed. And if let's say 100-foot long, 3-foot wide bed could produce 100 pounds of spinach, a pound of spinach sells for $10 a pound at the farmer's market. That's $1,000. You can plant 3 or 4 plantings of spinach or other greens, lettuce, arugula, baby kale in a bed in a given year. So we're talking about $4,000 versus $1,000 if you triple or quadruple crop. So my point here is that even things that are typically direct seeded can be transplanted in order to take advantage of all of these benefits and get a faster planting to harvest turnaround so that you can sneak another crop in there. Now, there's a tool that you all should be aware of that is really helpful for transplanting things that are spaced very close together, where you don't really want to be putting, bent over putting a spinach plant 2 inches next to another one because you'll be there all day. And that's this tool called the paper pot transplanter. I'm not going to click on this link to show you a video, but y'all can take an opportunity to look at it yourself. This system involves a tray that consists of these little kind of honeycomb paper grids that are filled with potting soil and are filled with seeds. And then when you plant it, these grids are each of these cells is actually connected to one another like a big chain. It's kind of like a like a chain of those little paper, little paper chain that little kids would make for like a birthday decoration, that they would hang, from over the door. This sort of comes apart in a long chain, and this tool allows you to kind of unravel that chain in the ground. So you can plant 200 plants in 5 minutes from a standing position, which is a lot nicer than stooping over. I mentioned earlier that it's really important that you use the right tools to get the plant population that you want. And that's why I would recommend getting a nice seeder like the Jang seeder rather than something cheaper, or even just sprinkling it in by hand. One reason is that you want to make sure you have a nice full population of plants. It's also important that your rows are spaced evenly. You could eyeball 4 or 5 rows of carrots on a bed, but they're going to wobble back and forth and not be even. And that's going to make it a lot more difficult to weed that by hand, because you're going to have big spaces and tight spaces. It's a lot better if you can use some sort of tool to mark the soil with rows that are evenly spaced, and then plant on those rows. That consistent spacing is going to make your planting a lot easier. And it's going to, whether you're working for yourself, you've got people that are working for you, it's going to make it a lot easier for them to plant the plants evenly without having to bring out a tape measure or anything like that. This tool on the lower left is called a gritter. And that can be purchased at Johnny's Seeds. And when you roll that over the soil, not only does it mark the spacing of the rows, but it marks the spacing within the rows. And you can buy different heads for that handle that have 1, 2, 3, or 1, 2, 4, and 6 rows for the different crops that you're growing. On the right, somebody has just slipped a couple pieces of PEX piping over the tines on that rake in order to create those rows. So there are a lot of tricks to make that happen. Now, if we're interested in maximizing our output per unit area, one thing to consider is that sometimes there are crops that grow very slowly but require a lot of space, like tomatoes. And there's space around those plants that for the first month and a half that the tomatoes are growing is being unutilized. That gives us an opportunity to plant other things close to those slower growing crops that don't interfere with the growth of that crop because lower, and because they grow faster and will be, they're lower and smaller. And they grow faster and they'll be harvested by the time the larger, slower growing plant actually spreads out and needs that space. And there's no better place to practice interplanting than in a high tunnel. High tunnels are valuable real estate. You've basically created California in Southwest Virginia. It's dry, you've controlled the precipitation, it's warm. You have to maximize your output in this real estate to make it pay, and you should, because it's a great opportunity. So oftentimes people will interplant things like lettuce or radishes or bok choy or beets around slower growing things like tomatoes or peppers or eggplant, and harvest those smaller things before the peppers or tomatoes or eggplant actually need to take advantage of that space. Has anybody ever tried this interplanting technique in their gardens or farms?
No, it's Linda.
Yeah. It certainly is a little bit, more management intensive. You've got to ensure that the intercropping is compatible, but it's a great way to maximize your bed space. All right, now moving on to everybody's favorite subject, and perhaps one of the most important concepts to really nail down in intensive organic vegetable production is weed management. Organic farmers often cite weeds as their #1 management challenge, and it can ruin and all the other efforts that you've put into preparing your soil and irrigating, planting, because weeds rob resources from your crops and interfere with harvesting. We typically think of weeding as pulling out individual weeds where you're targeting this weed, and then I'm going to get that weed, and then I'm going to get that weed, and you're weeding around a crop, which is pretty difficult because you're trying not to kill the crop and you're having to reach under it. First and foremost, we should be trying to control weeds before we've ever even planted the crop. Weeds come from seeds that exist in the soil in a population that's referred to as the weed seed bank. Keep in mind that those weed seeds are alive. They're waiting for an opportunity to germinate, and they can be managed and killed before you ever even plant a crop. And it's a lot easier to kill weeds when you don't have a crop there already growing, and that requires you to work around it and avoid it. Using that silage tarp that I mentioned earlier, not just to establish a new garden site, but to kill weeds on an established site before you plant your crop, is a great technique that a lot of those rock star farmers use. And basically, it gets so warm under that tarp and it's very moist that weeds are inclined to germinate. And when they do germinate, they're going to die within a matter of days because there's no light under there. And if you keep that tarp on the soil for several weeks, you can encourage many of the weeds in the top inch or two to germinate before you've ever even planted. Now, it is absolutely critical that the soil is prepared to whatever degree you want it to be prepared before you plant your crops, before you spread the tarp. So if you're going to make raised beds, make raised beds. If you're going to use a rake to level it out flat, and then put the tarp on. Because if you peel this tarp off and then get in there with a rototiller or whatever it is you're going to do to make your beds, you're just going to bring up new weed seeds that were deeper in the soil that didn't germinate while they were under that tarp. Now, after the tarp has been removed, or maybe you don't use the tarps, there are other techniques to kill weeds that grow on your beds before you plant your crop. And a great technique is to use a flame weeder. This model here can be purchased for a few $100. You can also get like a single burner model that is hooked up to a backpack that you put to a tank that you put on a backpack frame. And that's a heck of a lot cheaper and just as effective. It just takes a little bit more time. And this allows you to kill weeds that have germinated in your beds before you ever even plant your crop. And this is something that should be done intentionally. You should prepare your beds in advance, 2 or 3 weeks in advance, and actually encourage weeds to grow. That might involve irrigating if it's dry. You're basically saying, come on, come on weeds, come on out. It's safe. And as soon as they germinate, you flame them and kill them. And then when you plant your crop, you're planting into pre-weeded soil. So Ashley, looks like we're already over. I've probably got another 10 minutes and I'm happy to keep going, but I could also wrap it up. That's up to you.
Linda would like
If
you to keep going.
Yeah.
Okay.
If
And
anyone does need to jump off, feel free because I'll record the rest of it, so you'll have it to look back on later.
All right.
And
Sounds good. Sorry.
I also have, sorry, Alex, I also have tons of questions in chat for you afterwards.
Sounds good.
Thank you.
All right. Now, despite all your efforts, even if you use tarps and flaming, there will probably be weeds that will germinate, and you'll need to manage them in some way. And you know, I'm not trying to say that it is critical that your crop be 100% weed free, although it sure is beautiful when it is. It's just important that weeds don't go to seed, because then you are, you know, you're taking one step forward and then 2 steps back if you allow a few weeds to go to seed. And sometimes weeds can actually interfere with harvest, especially baby greens, where you know, you're having to like pick out little weeds from your salad mix. And in fact, even just a few, well, it can be bad enough that it's not even justifiable to spend the time doing that, and you just have to till it into the ground. Sometimes it's okay to let some weeds grow, especially if the crop that you are growing, it grows and is harvested very quickly, like radishes, turnips, maybe even lettuce heads, because you will be harvesting the crop and then tilling in the bed, or maybe covering it with a tarp before that weed has ever gone to seed, and then so it's not really a concern. But typically, you're going to have to do some sort of cultivation after you've actually planted the crop. And cultivation simply means disturbing the soil so that small weeds are uprooted onto the surface where they desiccate and dry. Now, you can also bury weeds with hilling discs and cut them with hose, but typically our goal is to target weeds when they're very, very small, in a stage of development referred to as the white thread stage, whereby if you were to pull it up out of the ground, you would see the root and the hypocotyl would be very underdeveloped, and they're white, and the roots aren't holding on to any soil, which can be sort of like a little lifeline for them to reroot back into the ground. And when weeds at this stage are uprooted, they will desiccate and die in a matter of minutes. And they're a lot easy. It's a lot easier to do this when they're small, because you're not fighting, you know, roots and leaves, and you don't even really see the weeds. You're just disturbing the soil, regardless of whether you see a weed or not. This usually has to be done, you know, maybe a week after you plant, and then another couple weeks afterwards, to kill weeds before the crop actually fills in the space and can kind of fend for itself. And there are a lot of different hand tools that are good for this, and I highly suggest investing in good quality cultivation tools from companies that sell cultivation tools to small scale farmers. Don't use whatever you can get at Lowe's or the local garden center, because weeding sucks. You're going to do more of it than you want. So you might as well get the tool that's going to make it easy and fast, and, you know, and know that you're, you know, using this tool for the job. There's another tool that is worth looking into called a flex tine weeder, and this is an adaptation from a tool that is used on big farms that's, you know, 15 feet wide and pulled by a tractor, and it consists of this series of little spring-loaded tines that scratch the soil and flick up and uproot these little baby weeds. And the neat thing about this tool is it can actually be used over top of an established vegetable crop, as long as the vegetable crop is stout enough to endure the action of those spring-loaded tines. And it might look like you're beating it up, and you probably are. You'll tear a leaf up, you'll rip a plant up here or there, but you can see how much surface area that tool covers and how thorough it is. It's a great way to very quickly kill lots of weeds, but it has to be done when the weeds are in the white thread stage. If they're any bigger than that, it doesn't work. Another way to manage weeds is to exclude them with some sort of plastic bed cover. On large scale farms, including the Virginia Tech farm and my farm here, we use a tractor pulled raised bed shaper that unrolls a roll of thin plastic film. It's called black plastic mulch. And then we punch holes in that and plant vegetables in that for some of our crops. That's a piece of equipment that's might be oversized for a small scale intensive farmer. But one thing that is more accessible is simply landscape fabric, which is a woven, thick, multi-year use material that you burn. You could cut or burn holes in it. The best way to do it is you can find a piece of pipe, it up on a grill or whatever in a fire, and then grab it with some tongs and punch your holes. Or they even make attachments for a flame weeder that you can use. And you can burn the holes at the specific spacing for whatever crop you're using. So that makes it a lot easier to plant. And it's just a way to eliminate the headache of weeds. It's important that the landscape fabric covers the pathways too. If you're going this far, might as well go all the way and cover the pathways. I would highly recommend leaning very hard on landscape fabric when you are just getting started, because all of those techniques for tarping and flaming and bed prep are challenging to master, and they take time to learn how to use effectively. And you will make mistakes, and you may not have all the tools right away, but you can go to Lowe's and buy some of this landscape fabric and punch some holes, and voila, you have weed-free crops. Now, this obviously isn't appropriate for direct seeded crops like carrots or baby salad mix, but a lot of crops that are transplanted can work in the system, and you could just transplant as much as you possibly could, transplant as many crops as you could to take advantage of this system. So I highly recommend this. And even for large scale farmers, I'm a huge advocate of leaning heavily on using black plastic mulch when you're just getting started, because the tools and techniques of mechanical cultivation on a large scale farm are also expensive and difficult to master. So this is just a good way to kind of make it easy for yourself when you get started. All right. In climate, it is critical that you have some form of supplemental irrigation. There are times of year, and maybe even whole years sometimes, when you might not have to irrigate. But there are usually periods during the year when you need some form of irrigation supplement, whatever you're getting from rainfall. Of course, you have to have irrigation in a tunnel because it's dry in there. And irrigation is oftentimes critical for establishing a crop when it's just been transplanted or it's direct seeded. It doesn't have its own root system. It doesn't have a large enough root system to go deep and absorb water in the deeper part of the soil profile. So if you're seeding carrots or salad mix, or you've just transplanted these vulnerable little lettuce plants, you usually need some kind of irrigation to get them established. Drip irrigation is a great approach for small scale farms and large scale farms. It has a lot of advantages over sprinkler irrigation because it only puts the water on the bed top, so you're not watering your pathways, which can encourage weeds. It doesn't get the foliage wet, which can encourage diseases. and it is a very low flow system. So it puts out water very slowly. So it might be more appropriate for like a well or a pump that doesn't have a lot of capacity. The challenges are that you've got to move and set up these drip lines, and they can get kind of annoying and cumbersome. Whereas a sprinkler, you can see on the top right, can work 3 to the left and 3 beds to the right with one line, and you don't have to move all these different lines when you're ready to till the field. So the sprinkler system can be a little bit easier, but usually a combination of both is what you want to have on your farm. And in a tunnel, you can actually set up an overhead sprinkler system, and that really eliminates the headache of bumping into or having to move or step over any on-ground sprinklers. Now, many of you may be, looking at the images of these people planting and weeding and think, boy, that seems like a heck of a lot of work. And it certainly is. And, small scale and large scale farms are always looking for opportunities to save labor and eliminate tasks, especially, more grueling tasks like bending over and, doing anything on your knees. And there, depending on the size of your piece of land, it may be appropriate to scale up a little bit. Now, at Homefield Farm and at my own farm, we are at a scale where it simply is not feasible for us to manage the amount of land we have using solely hand based techniques. It would just take too much time, and because I've got lots of students, but it would take too much management of all these individual people who are still learning and aren't comfortable, necessarily working outside and aren't familiar with our practices, in order to get them to do it the way we want we want them to do it. So at both farms, we have integrated more and more machines and mechanized techniques to eliminate hand labor and make things faster and easier and more efficient. Now, using tractors requires you to space out your rows and have big enough walkways to allow for the tools and the tires to operate. So your yield per square foot is typically going to go down, but I don't get paid per square foot. I get paid per hour. And we have enough land that our time is our limiting factor, not our land. And if you've got enough land where you don't need to maximize every single square foot, then and you are a little bit more mechanically oriented, you might look into doing a few tasks with tractors. One is using a raised bed shaper that lays a layer of plastic mulch, and this picture here is of a very, very nice plastic layer that costs $5,000, but you can get these for much less. You can get them for $1,500 to $2,000, and that saves a lot of work of laying out that landscape fabric with the holes and stapling it down and having to pull it back up again. There's machines that can help you lift up this plastic. That's a lot easier than doing it by hand. And the other kind of low-hanging fruit for mechanization is cultivation. You can find these old cultivating tractors all over the place in our area, and oftentimes, they're very affordable, maybe $1,500 to $3,000. They're usually going to need a little bit of mechanical work. So I'm personally not someone who can fix engines and machines, but I know people who are, so we just have folks who maintain these tractors, and they can be outfitted with an array of cultivating tools that can do the work of disturbing the soil and flipping up baby weeds for your weed management rather than having to do it by hand. And the other, I don't have a picture of this, but the other thing that I would mechanize if I were scaling up from this more intensive 1.5 acre system to a little bit more extensive, like 3 to 4 acre system, would be some sort of mechanical transplanter where people actually ride on the back of an implement that kind of hovers them close to the ground and put the plants in the ground from a seat rather than having to bend over or be on their knees. All right, so I just want to wrap up by kind of highlighting these rock star farmers that have created just a ton of free and paid resources that are available for teaching these techniques in much more detail than I could in an hour and a half. There's another farm that is in North Carolina, not too far from us, that just a little closer to home, that I would recommend looking at, called Tin Mothers Farm. This is a great example of somebody who's just started within the last couple of years and is having a lot of success using these types of intensive techniques. And then lastly, these tool and supplier companies are kind of the go-to entities for getting these small scale hand tools and some kind of quasi-mechanized tools. And then we're also super lucky to have one of the biggest organic farming materials supply companies here in Virginia, actually just down the road from me, Seven Springs Farm Supply. They're a great resource for organic fertilizers and pesticides, and even like minerals for livestock as well. If you want to follow up with me or just kind of see what I'm up to, for the next 25 days, I will be the manager of Homefield Farm at Virginia Tech, and we've got a pretty strong Instagram presence, and I'm certain that we will hire somebody to fill my shoes that will continue to do good work and be available for talks and workshops like this. But I will be at Riverstone Organic Farm, and you can check us out on social media or at riverstoneorganicfarm.com. And for now, you can contact me at my Virginia Tech email, and in the future, you can reach me at my Riverstone Organic Farm email. So, does anybody